Alright, so my name is Sandra Nguyen, and I am doing my presentation on the disease anthrax caused by Bacillus anthracis. So the first half of this video will be information pertaining to the actual bacteria, its modes of transmission, and some symptoms. And the second half will be more like a true crime podcast, in a sense. So enjoy. So here we have the lovely Spencer Reid in Criminal Minds, who was infected with anthrax. Obviously this is fictional, but it is based off of anthrax. We then have this TV show, which is fictional, but it is based off of true events from the 2001 anthrax attacks. We then have this, which is definitely not what we're talking about, but it is a rock band called Anthrax. And then we have these two images from the FBI database, which were from the 2001 anthrax attacks, which I will get into in the second half of this video. So what is anthrax? Anthrax is a disease caused by spore-forming, gram-positive, rod-shaped bacteria that produces anthrax toxins, and this bacteria is called Bacillus anthracis. So there is a vaccine for anthrax. The first vaccine was produced by Louis Pasteur, but that was never applied to humans. Rather, it was only tested on livestock and animals. However, the animals did have great success during the trials. So in the 50s and 60s, Biothrax was licensed by the NIH and the FDA. So anthrax is prevalent in areas where there are no legal requirements to vaccinate livestock, such as Central America, South America, North Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Caribbean islands. So how does it spread? So the spores of anthrax is actually naturally found in a lot of soil, and when the spores is introduced to humans, or let's say a cow, a livestock, it will germinate and cause the multiplication of the bacteria, which will then cause the release of more spores. And these spores will then go to infect humans, other livestock, or just remain in the soil, or get released into the air and travel through the air. So how does anthrax enter the body? There are 4 ways that anthrax enters the body, and there have been no solid evidence to suggest that this disease is transmittable between humans, rather from livestock or animals to humans, which makes this disease a zoonotic disease. And there are 4 ways that anthrax enters the body, which is cutaneously, through inhalation, through ingestion, and through injection. So for cutaneous transmission, the anthrax spores can actually enter small cuts on the skin, and it can also be transmitted through biting insects, such as flies or mosquitoes that was previously in contact with the infected livestock. So here is a really gross skin lesion warning. It's pretty graphic, so if you don't want to look, it's fine. I will warn you before. 3, 2, 1. Alright, so this is what happens when anthrax is introduced in the body cutaneously, which can cause these blisters and this intense swelling, and it can also cause the scary looking painless skin sores with a black center in the middle, which kind of looks like the plague. It's really scary. Alright, it is safe to look now. Okay, so next we have inhalation, which is the most lethal mode of transmission, and it's basically when the host breathes in the actual anthrax spores. So this will cause typical URI problems, which will then proceed and turn into more serious breathing issues. So here we can see a normal chest x-ray versus an anthrax infected chest x-ray. Here it's clear, we can see the diaphragm and we can see the heart. Here there is a lot of opacity, which is consistent with infiltrates and effusion, which basically means that there is a buildup of fluid in the lungs in the pleural cavity. So when anthrax toxins are introduced into the body through inhalation means, the toxins will actually enter the bloodstream through the pulmonary system, which will then cause tissue decay and hemorrhaging. Next we have ingestion. This is when the host will eat infected meat, but that was not properly cooked. So that includes typical URI symptoms, so fever, cold, cough, congestion, but it will also cause symptoms that are very similar to food poisoning. However, it becomes more serious when they start to have bloody stools and bloody vomiting. Next, we have injection. Injection is mostly associated with heroin injecting drug users in Northern Europe. And this is very similar to cutaneous transmissions, besides the fact that the spores are able to enter the bloodstream much faster and much more effectively. So again, gross photo warning in 3, 2, 1. So here, this is a drug user, and as you can see, there is a lot of erythema as well as significant swelling to her upper body, and this is most likely the onset, and it would only progress worse if not treated properly. All right, it's safe now. Next, we go into my favorite part, the Amerithrax. So what is the Amerithrax? The Amerithrax is the 2001 anthrax attacks where 7 letters were sent to U.S. senators and media figures and news outlets following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So here are the letters that they found in two of the envelopes. So here you can actually see that some of the letters are a little bold, and I will get to that later, which is super interesting and funny, honestly. So here we have wave 1 and wave 2. Wave 1 was dated September 18th, 2001. Wave 2 was dated October 9th, 2001. In wave 1, 5 letters containing anthrax spores were sent to ABC News, CBS News, NBC News, New York Post, and National Enquirer. In wave 2, 2 letters containing anthrax spores were sent to Tom Daschle, which was the South Dakota U.S. Senator at the time, and Patrick Lee, which was the Vermont U.S. Senator at the time. Now, what was interesting was that in wave 1, the anthrax spores were actually contained in almost this dirt, dog food-like substance material, while in wave 2, the spores were actually 100% pure, and it was a fine powder, and he actually had to tape the edges so that it wouldn't leak out. So at least 22 people were infected by the anthrax mailings, and 5 of the infected did die. So that includes Joseph Curson, Thomas Morris Jr., Otto Lee Lundgren, Robert Stevens, and Catherine Nguyen. We also have secondary exposures from the anthrax mailings, and that includes 35 postal facilities and commercial mailrooms that tested positive for exposure to anthrax. We also have 7 out of 26 buildings on Capitol Hill that also tested positive for anthrax exposure. 31 people tested positive for anthrax exposure that were not included in the 22 that were actually infected by the anthrax. We then have 10,000 that were deemed at risk for possible exposure to anthrax spores, and they all underwent antibiotic prophylaxis. So here are the people of interest that were investigated by the FBI. So first we have Dr. Stephen J. Hatfield and Dr. Bruce E. Evans. So first let's look at Dr. Stephen J. Hatfield. So he had numerous individuals who suspected him to be the perpetrator for the mailing, and they actually contacted the FBI to show their concern. We also know that from 1997 to 1999, Hatfield had a total unrestricted access to the MS strain at this lab, which the spores and the bacteria from the letters were traced back to this specific strain. He also filled multiple prescriptions of ciprofloxacin in 2001, and at this time, this was the only known antibiotic that would treat anthrax symptoms post-onset. However, ultimately, he was eliminated as a suspect, and although he did have access to the MS strain at this lab, he did not have access to RMR 1029, which is the actual spore batch which the spores from the letters came from. So after he was eliminated as a suspect, he filed many lawsuits against different organizations for defamation, and he actually won, I think, over $2 million and about $20,000 every single year for the next 20 years for the defamation. So now let's look at Dr. Bruce E. Evans. On November 1st, 2007, search warrants were executed and FBI found large collections of letters sent to members of Congress and news medias over the past 20 years. They also found multiple artillery weapons, homemade armor plate, and his psychiatric evaluation stated that he was homicidal and sociopathic with clear intentions. So let's go into the summary of evidence implicating Dr. Evans. So first we have opportunity. He had access to not only the Ames strain of the Bacillus anthracis, but he also had access to the spore batch RMR 1029. And not only did he have access to it, he actually created it and maintained the spore batch in this lab that was then used for the anthrax mailings. Next, we have motive. During this time, Evans was in an anthrax vaccine program to which he dedicated the last 20 years of his life to, and this program was definitely failing, and Evans feared that the program would be discontinued. So after the anthrax mailings, conveniently, the program suddenly rejuvenated. Next, Evans had an extensive history of mental health struggles, and that included depression, suicidal ideations, and homicidal ideations. We then have proximity to source of envelopes used. Through scientific analysis of the envelopes that were used in the anthrax mailings, it actually found that the envelopes were from one specific batch that were sold at a specific post office during a specific amount of time in Frederick, Maryland, which was about a few blocks away from Dr. Evans' house. We then have language used in the letters. So during this time, the FBI did have access to his records, and they did see that he would use similar language in his emails to the actual letters. And another thing was that he actually used a code. So during the warrant, they found a book that had a bunch of secret codes in them, and one of them was the codon code. So here we can see that some of the letters are bolded, so there's T, 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 A, T, T, A, T, and that's phenylalanine, asparagine, and tyrosine, and the singular letter identifications is F and Y. Now, people knew that he really hated New York, so people suspect that what he really wanted to say was F New York. So next we have consciousness of guilt. He had a series of actions and he made several statements that were evidence of a guilty conscience. So that included sending multiple emails after the attacks, proposing a nonsensical explanation as to why people were getting infected with anthrax, even though he was a top scientist in microbiology studying anthrax. He also would make up really far-reaching theories to propose that his two best friends from the lab were involved somehow in the anthrax mailings. And he decontaminated his entire office and his lab and did not report it and did not tell anyone about it. He also had a history of disguising his identity in the past, so he would drive hours to a specific location and drop off a letter with a specific pseudonym, and he had about a dozen pseudonyms. He also had obsessive behavior and stalking. So in his early 20s, while he was in college, he would drive 3 hours to Princeton University just to stalk a specific sorority house. So that was Kappa Kappa Gamma at Princeton University. And he would sit there for 10 minutes and then leave. What makes this crazier is that the letters that were sent from a mailbox outside of the Kappa Kappa Gamma sorority house, the same house that he had repeatedly stalked in his early 20s. Crazy. He then has the inability to explain his own behavior. So before the anthrax mailings, he would spend a lot of time in the laboratory by himself, and this was very unusual, and he couldn't explain why he was doing that. And ultimately, he did die on July 29, 2008 by a Tylenol overdose after learning that criminal charges were likely to be filed against him for the anthrax attacks by the FBI. So the FBI did close the case and proposed that Dr. Evans was the sole perpetrator of the anthrax attacks. So what do you think? Was it Evans? Or was he just unfortunate to be wrapped into the investigation? Did he kill himself knowing he was guilty, or was he just depressed and suicidal? Thank you.